Good evening, and welcome back to Drift Through History. There are civilizations that existed for centuries, and then there is China. What we're going to talk about tonight is not a dynasty, not a war, not a single emperor or a single era, but a system. A way of organizing human society that was invented in the 3rd century BCE and that kept running in various forms and under various degrees of stress for more than 2,000 years. 2,000 years of emperors, of bureaucrats taking examinations on the philosophy of Confucius, of walls being built against the steppe, of the Silk Road carrying silk west and ideas east, of poetry and painting and porcelain and gunpowder and paper money and the compass. Almost every major intellectual and material technology of the pre-modern world either invented in China or substantially refined there, and underneath all of it, a political philosophy so durable and so adaptive that it outlasted every external challenge the world could bring against it, until the 19th century brought a challenge it was not equipped to answer. This is the story of Imperial China. It is 2,000 years long, and it covers everything from the terror of the first emperor to the sadness of the last, from the cosmopolitan splendor of Tang Chang'an to the commercial revolution of the Song, from Genghis Khan's horsemen cresting the Great Wall to the Jesuits bringing telescopes to the Forbidden City, from the treasure fleets of Zheng He sailing to Africa to the opium clippers of the British East India Company sailing to Canton. It is too large to tell completely. Every dynasty we mention tonight has been the subject of shelf lengths of scholarly literature. Every emperor, every philosophical school, every technological breakthrough has its specialists and its debates. What we can do is follow the main current, the great thread that runs from the moment Qin Shi Huang declared himself the first emperor of a unified China in 221 BCE, to the moment Puyi, the last emperor, signed his abdication papers in February 1912, and understand what made the whole structure hold, what made it repeatedly fracture and repeatedly rebuild itself, and what it means that this particular experiment in civilization lasted as long as it did. Before we get settled, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is genuinely what you come here for. And as always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights. Let the room go soft. 2,000 years is a long time, and we should settle in properly. You have nowhere to be. And let us begin at the very beginning of the imperial age. In a China that was exhausted by war, in a kingdom called Qin that everyone feared, and with a man who was going to change everything. Before there was an imperial China, there was a China of warring kingdoms. For roughly 2.5 centuries before the Qin unification in 221 BCE, a period historians call the Warring States period, though the Chinese have a term for it that translates more vividly as the age when the states fought each other. 7 major kingdoms and a rotating cast of smaller ones competed for dominance over the territory of the Yellow River Plain and its surrounding lands with a ferocity and a duration that exhausted entire populations and transformed both the military and the intellectual landscape of the Chinese world. The exhaustion mattered because it created a hunger for order. The intellectual transformation mattered more because it produced the philosophical schools that would define the values and the governance of Chinese civilization for 2,000 years after the wars were over. The 100 schools of thought, the explosion of philosophical debate and innovation that the Warring States period produced, is one of the great intellectual moments in world history, comparable in its creative intensity and its long-term consequences to classical Athens or the Arabic intellectual efflorescence of the 8th and 9th centuries CE. Confucius had lived and taught in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, and his students and their students had developed his ideas about the proper ordering of human relationships, the obligations of loyalty, of filial piety, of ritual conduct, of benevolent governance, into a comprehensive philosophy of social organization that became known as Confucianism. The Daoist tradition, associated with the legendary Laozi and developed by Zhuangzi, offered a very different vision. Not the regulation of human society through careful attention to ritual and hierarchy, but the cultivation of a spontaneous harmony with the natural order of things, the Tao, the way that underlies all phenomena, and that human interference with ritual and governance disrupts rather than promotes. The Legalists, the school whose ideas would actually win the Warring States period in the most direct sense, argued for none of this. They argued that the only thing that mattered in government was power and compliance, that human beings responded to reward and punishment rather than to moral suasion, that a state that wanted to survive in the competitive environment of the warring states needed to harness human energies through a system of clearly defined laws and strictly enforced punishments, and that sentiment, tradition, and philosophical abstraction were luxuries that the political situation could not afford. The three schools that mattered most to the subsequent history of China deserve more than a brief summary, because their specific ideas and the specific tensions between them shaped imperial governance for 2,000 years in ways that are still present in the political culture of China today. Confucius, Confuzi, born around 551 BCE in the small state of Lu in what is now Shandong province, was a minor aristocrat and an aspiring official who spent most of his career failing to persuade the rulers of the states he served that his ideas about governance were worth implementing. His teachings, preserved by his students in the Analects, were not systematic philosophy in the abstract European sense, but practical wisdom. Specific advice about how a person should behave in the specific relationships that structure human life. The 5 key relationships of Confucian ethics: ruler and subject, parent and child, husband and wife, elder sibling and younger sibling, friend and friend, were each characterized by specific obligations that ran in both directions. The ruler owed benevolence to the subject, the subject owed loyalty to the ruler, the parent owed nurture to the child owed filial piety to the parent, and so on across each relationship. The Confucian vision of a well-governed society was not a vision of individual rights, or of contractual obligations between equals, but of a web of hierarchical relationships, each pair of people in the web doing what their position required, all the way up through the social order to the emperor himself, whose personal moral cultivation was the foundation of the entire structure. If the emperor was virtuous, if he governed with humanness, with ritual correctness, with genuine concern for the welfare of his people, then the moral influence of his virtue would radiate outward through the social hierarchy and produce good behavior throughout the realm, without the need for harsh punishment. The Confucian ruler did not rule by force or by law, he ruled by example. Mencius, Mengzi, who lived roughly a century after Confucius, developed the Confucian tradition in a specific direction that had enormous consequences. He argued that human nature was fundamentally good, that every human being was born with the innate capacity for moral feeling, specifically the 4 moral sprouts of benevolence, righteousness, propriety, and wisdom, and that the cultivation of virtue was therefore not a matter of imposing external discipline on a resistant nature, but of developing and nurturing capacities that were already there. This optimistic anthropology was not merely a philosophical position. it had political implications. If human beings were innately good, then a ruler who governed well, who created conditions in which people could develop their moral capacities, would produce a genuinely moral society. And conversely, a ruler who governed badly, who oppressed the people, who extracted too much in taxes, who failed to provide the conditions for the people's material welfare, was not merely failing in his duties, but was actively corrupting the human nature of those he was supposed to nurture. Mencius went further than any previous Confucian thinker in articulating the right of the people to remove such a ruler. A ruler who completely failed in his duties was no longer a king but a mere fellow man, and removing him was not rebellion but the restoration of proper order. This was as close as Imperial China's political philosophy came to a theory of popular sovereignty, and it was taken seriously enough to be cited across 2,000 years by both reformers and rebels. Han Feizi, the legalist thinker who served the Qin court and whose texts Qin Shi Huang reportedly loved so much that he said he would die happy if he could meet their author, argued for a conception of governance that was almost the exact inverse of Mencius's. Human nature, in the legalist view, was not good. It was selfish, short-sighted and responsive only to immediate self-interest. A ruler who tried to govern through moral example and through the cultivation of virtue in his subjects was naive at best, and dangerous at worst. Dangerous because the people he was hoping to educate were, in the meantime, pursuing their own interests at the expense of the state. The only effective government was one that aligned self-interest with the state's requirements through a carefully designed system of reward and punishment. Reward those who serve the state's needs effectively, punish those who fail to do so, and the human machinery of the state will function regardless of the moral quality of its individual parts. The emphasis on law, on the consistent application of clearly stated rules, on the systematic rather than the discretionary exercise of power, these are not nothing. They are the foundations of what modern political science would call rule of law rather than rule of men. The problem was that Han Feizi's legalism had no mechanism for limiting the ruler himself. The ruler stood above the system of rewards and punishments rather than within it, which meant the system had no corrective for a bad ruler. That was the flaw that destroyed the Qin. The state of Qin, occupying the northwest of the Chinese world in what is now Shanxi province, had adopted legalist philosophy under its chief minister Shang Yang in the 4th century BCE, and had transformed itself, over the following century, into the most ruthlessly efficient military and administrative state in China. The state's agricultural productivity was organized to maximize the surplus that could be extracted and directed toward military purposes. Its army was organized around a system of merit promotion. Rank and reward were tied to battlefield performance rather than to birth, which created a military culture of tremendous aggressiveness. Its administration was centralized and standardized in ways that gave the Qin court direct control over the entire state, rather than through the feudal intermediaries that other kingdoms still relied on. Qin was, in the language of a later era, a war machine, and it was pointed at its neighbors. The boy who became the first emperor was born Yingzheng in 259 BCE, the son of the king of Qin. He was 13 years old when his father died, and he became king, which meant that for the first years of his reign the actual governance was handled by a regent. His chief minister Lu Buwei, whose relationship to the royal family was complicated enough to generate a persistent rumour, probably invented by the Han dynasty historians who succeeded Qin and who wanted to discredit the Qin legacy, that Yingzheng was actually Lu Buwei's illegitimate son rather than the king's. Yingzhe took personal control of the government when he came of age, dismissed and eventually forced the suicide of Lu Buwei, and then prosecuted, with the systematic ferocity that legalist state management had made possible, the conquest of the 6 remaining kingdoms that stood between Qin and total dominance of the Chinese world. One by one, over 11 years of warfare, the kingdoms fell: Han in 230, Zhao in 228, Wei in 225, Chu in 223, Yan in 222, and finally Qi in 221. The conquest was complete. Yinzhen then did something that had no precedent. He declared that the title of king was insufficient for the ruler of a unified China. The kings of the ancient dynasties, the sage rulers of the mythological past, had held the title Huang, and the lords of the spirit world held the title Di. He combined the two into a new title, Huangdi, Emperor, and he added the prefix Shi, meaning first. He would be the Qinshi Huangdi, the first August Emperor of Qin. His successors would be the second Emperor, the third, in a line he expected to continue for 10,000 generations. It lasted 15 years after his death. But the 15 years of the Qin dynasty, and the 11 years before it in which Yingzheng unified the country, produced institutional changes of such fundamental importance that the dynasties that came after, including the ones that most thoroughly repudiated the Qin legacy and castigated its brutality, could not and did not undo them. The centralized administrative structure that Qin imposed on its conquered territories, the system of commanderies and prefectures that replaced the feudal kingdoms with directly administered units reporting to the central government, was the template for every subsequent Chinese imperial administration. The standardization of the writing system, which Qin enforced across its newly conquered territories to replace the regional script variants that the separate kingdoms had developed, created the shared written language that allowed educated Chinese to communicate across dialectal barriers for 2,000 years. The same characters, more or less, that educated Chinese still read today. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency, of the width of cart axles, of the length of a foot, of the weight of a unit of bronze, created the material preconditions for a unified economy across a territory that stretched from the Yellow River to the South China Sea. These were not small things. They were the structural skeleton of a civilization that has outlasted the man who built it by 2 millennia. The Great Wall that Qin Shi Huang built, or rather, the wall that he connected and extended from the earlier walls that the northern kingdoms had built individually against the steppe nomads, is the most famous symbol of the Qin state and perhaps of China itself. The historical Great Wall of the Qin period was not the magnificent stone and brick construction that tourists visit near Beijing today. That wall dates primarily from the Ming dynasty, 14 centuries later. The Qin Wall was an enormous earthwork, laboriously constructed by hundreds of thousands of conscripted labourers, stretching across the northern frontier to mark the boundary between the Chinese agricultural world and the steppe world of the Xiongnu nomads, who were the most serious external military threat the new empire faced. Hundreds of thousands of men died building it, and the traditions that accumulated around those deaths, the story of Lady Mengjiang, whose husband dies in the wall's construction, and whose weeping causes a section of the wall to collapse, revealing his bones, are an early example of what would become a recurring Chinese cultural mode: the acknowledgement of the human cost of the state's ambitions in literary and legendary form, even when the official record celebrated those ambitions without reservation. The first emperor's obsession with his own mortality is one of the most fascinating aspects of his personality, and one of the most productive subjects of his reign. He believed, with the earnestness that the Daoist tradition of seeking physical immortality encouraged, that there might be an elixir of immortality somewhere in the world. a substance or a formula that could stop the aging of his body and allow him to rule forever. He sent expeditions into the eastern seas, seeking the legendary islands where immortals were said to dwell. He patronized alchemists and magicians who claimed to be working on the problem. He consulted oracles and performed elaborate rituals. None of it worked. He died in 210 BCE on an inspection tour of the Eastern Empire far from his capital, and the circumstances of his death were kept secret by his chief eunuch Zhao Gao, long enough for Zhao Gao to manipulate the succession in ways that placed a weaker second son on the throne and put effective power in Zhao Gao's own hands. The army that was supposed to guard him in death was already under construction before his death, a literally breathtaking project that involved the manufacture of approximately 8,000 life-size terracotta soldiers, individually modelled with distinct faces and arranged in battle formation in underground pits near the burial mound at what is now Xi'an. The figures were originally painted in vivid colours that have since faded. They were accompanied by terracotta horses, bronze chariots, and the actual weapons of the period. The burial mound that they guard has not been excavated. Ancient sources describe it as containing a model of the Chinese world, with rivers of mercury representing the actual rivers, a ceiling of pearls representing the stars, and crossbows rigged to fire automatically at anyone who violated the tomb. Modern surveys have detected anomalously high mercury concentrations in the soil around the mound, which is as close as archaeology has come to confirming the ancient description. The Qin dynasty collapsed with breathtaking speed after the first emperor's death. The second emperor, managed by Zhao Gao, continued the conscript labour projects and the harsh legal regime without the first emperor's administrative genius to justify the costs and the resentments that had been building across the conquest and the construction projects broke into open revolt within 3 years. The wars that followed, the Chu-Han contention between the rebel warlord Xiang Yu of the old state of Chu and the commoner-turned-general Liu Bang, lasted 4 years and ended in 202 BCE with Liu Bang's victory at the Battle of Gaixia, Xiang Yu's suicide, and Liu Bang's assumption of the imperial title as the Emperor Gaozu of the Han dynasty. The Han dynasty that Liu Bang founded in 202 BCE was, in many of its structural features, a direct continuation of the Qin institutions it officially repudiated. The commandery prefecture administrative system survived. The standardized writing system survived. The centralized imperial authority survived. What changed was the ideology that legitimized it. The Qin had ruled by legalism, by the naked assertion of power backed by law and punishment, with little ideological decoration beyond the emperor's claim to have received the mandate of heaven. The Han, chastened by the speed of the Qin collapse and by the obvious insufficiency of pure coercion as a governing principle, turned to Confucianism. The mandate of heaven, Qianming, is one of the foundational concepts of Chinese political philosophy, and it deserves careful attention because it shaped the entire dynastic system's self-understanding for 2,000 years. The concept originated in the early Zhou dynasty, in the 11th century BCE, as a way of explaining and justifying the Zhou overthrow of the Shang. The Shang kings had become corrupt and cruel. Heaven, a moral force that governs the universe and has specific expectations for human rulers, had withdrawn its mandate from them, and the Zhou, who were more virtuous, had received that mandate and were therefore justified in taking power. The concept had several crucial logical implications. First, it meant that the emperor's right to rule was not absolute or inherited, but was conditional on his virtue and effective governance. Second, it meant that natural disasters, famines, floods, and plagues were not random events but signs. Signals from heaven that the emperor's mandate was weakening, that the moral quality of his governance was insufficient. Third, it meant that a successful rebellion was by definition legitimate, because it demonstrated that heaven had withdrawn the mandate from the old dynasty and given it to the new one. The man who successfully overthrew the emperor was thereby proven to have had the mandate. The emperor who was overthrown was thereby proven to have lost it. The system was, from a certain angle, thoroughly circular, but it was the kind of circularity that served real social and political functions, providing a framework within which political change could be understood as morally ordered rather than as mere violence, and providing every emperor with a constant incentive to govern well, because visible government failures were legible as signs of heaven's displeasure. The Han dynasty institutionalized the link between Confucianism and the imperial state that would define Chinese civilization for the next 2,000 years. Under Emperor Wu of Han, Wudi, who reigned from 141 to 87 BCE, and whose 54-year reign is one of the longest and most consequential in Chinese history, Confucianism was formally established as the state ideology. A grand academy was created to train officials in the Confucian classics and the civil service examination system that would remain the primary route to government employment in China until 1905 CE was given its first substantial development. The examinations tested candidates on their knowledge of the Confucian canonical texts, the 4 books and 5 classics that encoded the social philosophy and historical learning that the tradition considered essential for governance, and successful candidates were eligible for appointment to official positions. The system was not fully meritocratic from the beginning. Family connections, wealth, and patronage continued to matter throughout the imperial period, but the principle that government office should be open to any man capable of demonstrating mastery of the required learning, regardless of birth, was radical in the context of the aristocratic and feudal systems that contemporary Mediterranean and European societies were operating, and its long-term effects on Chinese social structure and cultural values were profound. Emperor Wu of Han was also the emperor who doubled the size of the empire. His campaigns against the Xiongnu, the nomadic confederation that controlled the steppe north of China, and that had been extracting tribute and conducting devastating raids since before the unification, were among the most sustained and expensive military operations in Chinese history to that point. The cost in men and resources was staggering, but the campaigns pushed the Xiongnu back from the northern frontier, extended Han control into Central Asia, and opened the trade routes that became the Silk Road. The name is a modern coinage. No one in the Han period called it that, but the network of overland trade routes that connected the Han Empire to the Parthian Empire of Persia, the Kushan Empire of Central Asia, and eventually to the Roman world was one of the most consequential commercial and cultural exchanges in the history of the ancient world. Silk moved west, gold and glass moved east. Buddhism moved east along the same routes, entering China through the Central Asian trading communities and establishing itself over the following centuries as one of the 3 great intellectual and spiritual traditions of Chinese civilization, alongside Confucianism and Daoism. The Han dynasty produced in Sima Qian, one of the great historians of the ancient world. Sima Qian was the grand historian at the court of Emperor Wu, and his Shiji, Records of the Grand Historian, was the model for every subsequent Chinese dynasty's official history. He covered the history of China from the legendary Yellow Emperor through his own time, in a format that combined dynastic annals with biographical accounts of key figures, with treatises on economics, ritual, astronomy, and other systematic topics. He wrote it under extraordinary personal circumstances. He had spoken in defense of a general who had surrendered to the Xiongnu, which was treason, and Emperor Wu had ordered him castrated, the punishment of palace eunuchs, reserved for those whose crimes were too serious for a fine, but whose execution would be too convenient a release. Sima Qian chose to accept the punishment rather than die, because he had not yet finished his history, and he wrote about the experience in his famous letter to a friend with a directness and an anguish that makes it one of the most personal documents of the ancient Chinese world. The man who produced the foundational text of Chinese historical scholarship wrote it in the aftermath of a humiliation from which, by the values of his time, death would have been the appropriate response. That he chose instead to keep writing tells you something important about what he thought the writing was for. The Han dynasty split in 9 CE, when a court official named Wang Mang seized power and established a brief interregnum dynasty called the Xin, before being overthrown in 23 CE and the Han restored. The restored Han, known as the Eastern Han because its capital moved from Chang'an to Luoyang, continued for another 2 centuries before collapsing in 220 CE into the Three Kingdoms period, a fragmentary era that is itself one of the great subjects of Chinese literary and historical tradition, immortalized in the 14th century historical novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which remains one of the most widely read works in the Chinese literary tradition today. The Han as a dynasty lasted from 206 BCE to 220 CE, 4 centuries, through which Chinese civilization consolidated its institutional and cultural foundations so thoroughly that the people of China called themselves, and still call themselves, the Han people. The centuries between the fall of the Han in 220 CE and the reunification of China under the Sui dynasty in 589 CE are sometimes treated as a long interlude, a dark ages of Chinese history, a period of fragmentation and chaos that interrupts the story of imperial civilization. This is both true and misleading. True, in the sense that political unity was not maintained and that the northern half of China was conquered and ruled, for substantial portions of this period, by non-Chinese peoples from the steppe. The Jin dynasty collapsed before successive waves of Central Asian invaders in the early 4th century, and the following century and a half saw northern China divided among a series of states founded by the Xiongnu, Jie, Di, Qiang, Jie, Jie again, and Xianbei peoples, a period sometimes called the 16 Kingdoms, while the Chinese dynasties that preserved something of the Han cultural tradition survived in the south, in the Yangtze River Valley, as a series of short-lived southern dynasties. Misleading, in the sense that the period was extraordinarily productive culturally and spiritually. It was during this long fragmentation that Buddhism established itself as a major force in Chinese civilization, that the aristocratic culture of the southern courts produced some of the most refined poetry and calligraphy in the Chinese tradition, that the philosophical engagement between Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism that would generate the Neo-Confucianism of the Song dynasty began its long preliminary development. Buddhism's arrival in China and its transformation from an Indian import into a Chinese religion is one of the most remarkable processes of cultural adaptation in the history of world religion. Buddhism entered China along the Silk Road in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE and was initially understood through the conceptual categories that Chinese thinkers already possessed, particularly through Daoist concepts, because the Buddhist vocabulary of Dharma and Nirvana and emptiness found provisional translations in Taoist terms that were not exactly accurate but were close enough to make the new religion comprehensible. Over the following centuries, as Chinese pilgrims travelled to India to study and bring back Buddhist texts, Faxian in the early 5th century, Xuanzang in the early 7th century, whose journey to India inspired the 16th century novel Journey to the West, one of the great classics of Chinese literature. The translation and interpretation of Buddhist scripture into Chinese became one of the major intellectual projects of Chinese culture, producing a distinctively Chinese Buddhism that retained the core teachings and practices of the Indian original, while integrating them into a cultural world organized around very different assumptions about family, social hierarchy, and the meaning of human life. The Sui dynasty that reunified China in 589 under the Emperor Wen did for Chinese civilization something analogous to what the Qin had done 4 centuries earlier. It imposed unity on a fragmented political landscape, created administrative and physical infrastructure of lasting importance, and then collapsed almost immediately after the death of its founding generation, leaving the work of consolidation to the dynasty that followed. The Grand Canal, the greatest water engineering project of the pre-modern world, linking the Yellow River in the north to the Yangtze River and its tributaries in the south, eventually extending from the Beijing area to Hangzhou over a total length of nearly 1,800 kilometers, was substantially built under the Sui Emperor Yang, who conscripted something in the order of 5 million labourers for the project, with catastrophic mortality. The canal was built. The Sui dynasty collapsed in civil war and rebellion in 618, and the Tang dynasty that replaced it used the canal and the agricultural productivity of the southern Yangtze basin that the canal connected to the northern military frontier for 3 centuries of prosperity and expansion. The Tang dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, is the dynasty that Chinese historical memory has most consistently identified as the Great Golden Age, the peak of Chinese civilization, and the association is not without foundation even if it is somewhat idealized. Its capital at Chang'an was, in the early Tang period, one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the world, a planned city on a grid pattern, roughly 10 kilometers on each side, with a population that may have reached 1 million people at its height. Inside Chang'an, along its broad straight avenues and in its 2 great regulated markets, you would find merchants from Persia, Central Asia, India, Arabia, Korea, and Japan, alongside the full range of the Chinese imperial establishment. You would find Buddhist temples, Daoist temples, Nestorian Christian churches, Zoroastrian fire temples, and, later in the dynasty, mosques. The specific cosmopolitan flavour of Tang Chang'an was the product of the Silk Road at its height, of the Tang Empire's military reach into Central Asia under the early emperors, and of a conscious Tang openness to foreign ideas and practices that expressed itself in court music that incorporated Central Asian instruments, in fashion that favoured Central Asian styles, in cuisine that included Persian flatbreads and grape wine, in an artistic tradition that absorbed and synthesized visual influences from across the breadth of Eurasia. The Tang imperial family, the Li clan, was itself of mixed Chinese and Tuoba Xianbei ancestry, descendants of one of the non-Chinese peoples who had ruled northern China during the fragmentation period, which gave the dynasty a particular openness to the peoples and cultures of the steppe and Central Asia that was both a strength and, eventually, a source of the military crisis that would nearly destroy it. The Tang system of frontier defense relied heavily on non-Chinese military commanders who led armies of non-Chinese troops in the defense of the empire's vast borders. This system was effective and cheap, but it created generals of enormous military power whose political loyalty to the Tang court was conditional rather than absolute. The Anlushan Rebellion of 755 to 763 CE is the event around which the Tang dynasty's history pivots, and it is impossible to understand Tang culture, Tang poetry, or the social world of the Tang without understanding it. and Lushan was a general of Sogdian and Turkic ancestry who had risen to command 3 of the frontier armies simultaneously, a concentration of military power that his rival at court, the chief minister Yang Guozhong, correctly identified as dangerous and incorrectly handled through provocations that pushed An Lushan into open revolt. In 755, An Lushan's forces swept south from the northern frontier and captured Luoyang and then Chang'an. The Emperor Xuanzong, the same emperor whose long, prosperous reign had patronized Li Bai and Du Fu and Wang Wei, whose court was the center of the golden age of Tang culture, whose love for the concubine Yang Guifei was celebrated in some of the most famous poems ever written in Chinese, fled the capital with his court. On the road to Sichuan, the Imperial Guard mutinied. They killed Yang Guozhong, whom they blamed for the disaster. They then demanded the death of Yang Guifei, Xuanzong's beloved concubine and Yang Guozhong's cousin. Xuanzong, at 70 years old, was forced by his own soldiers to order the strangling of the woman he loved. Baijui's Song of Everlasting Sorrow, written decades later after the rebellion had been suppressed and Xuanzong was long dead, is perhaps the greatest poem in the Chinese tradition, and it is a poem about that moment, the love, the loss, the exile, and the undying grief of the old emperor who had built a golden age and watched it burned. The rebellion was suppressed by 763, partly through the military efforts of Tang loyalists and partly through the assistance of Uyghur allies whose price for their help, the right to sack Luoyang, the eastern capital, for 3 days, was paid with characteristic Tang pragmatism. But the political structure of the Tang never fully recovered. The military governors who had fought the rebellion had been given emergency powers and territory that they were disinclined to return, and the decentralized military power that had characterized the frontier defense system now characterized the interior of the empire as well. The late Tang period was marked by the intermittent struggle of the central government to reassert control over regional military powers, a struggle it never fully won, and by the political interference of the palace eunuchs, who had risen during the rebellion to positions of enormous influence at court, because they were the only people the emperors could trust, having no independent territorial base, whose factional conflicts with the regular bureaucracy consumed enormous political energy across the final century of the dynasty. And yet the poetry. The Tang dynasty produced approximately 49,000 surviving poems by approximately 2,200 poets, a concentration of lyric achievement that has no parallel in any literary tradition of any century anywhere in the world. Li Bai, who died in 762, the year before the rebellion ended, was the poet whose work most fully expressed the Tang sense of its own golden possibility. His poems about wine and friendship and the moon and the mountains and the freedom of a man who has drunk enough to forget the weight of official duty have an exuberance and a romantic confidence that is specific to the early Tang, to the moment before the rebellion changed everything. Du Fu, his contemporary and friend, wrote from the other side of that divide. His great cycle of poems about the An Lushan rebellion, about the displacement of ordinary people and the destruction of the world they had known, about old men weeping at the loss of their sons and women left to manage farmsteads alone, are the poems through which the Tang expressed its anguish at the cost of the Golden Age's ending. The complete poems of Du Fu are, among other things, the most comprehensive social documentary of the mid-8th century in any language. He wrote about grain prices and military recruitment and refugee camps, and the specific quality of moonlight over a ruined city in ways that make the abstract history of the An Lushan rebellion into something you can almost smell. Wang Wei, the third of the great Tang poets, was a painter and a Buddhist as well as a poet, and his poems about the natural world, about mountain retreats and autumn evenings and the specific way that water moves over stones in a particular light, carry the Zen Buddhist aesthetic of attentive presence in the immediate moment into the lyric tradition with a quietness and a precision that still produces in readers who encounter it, in any language, a moment of recognition. The three of them, Li Bai, Du Fu, Wang Wei, represent the range of what a single dynasty's literary culture could achieve at its most fully realized. And the fact that they were contemporaries, that they knew each other and commented on each other's work, and that they wrote within a single literary tradition whose conventions they all shared and all transformed in different directions, is itself a measure of the Tang's cultural intensity. The examination system had, by the Tang period, become the primary pathway to official status for men who were not born into the great aristocratic families, and the poetry examination, the requirement that candidates for certain examination degrees compose poetry in specified forms as part of their test, meant that the ability to write regulated verse in the Tang style was a practical career skill, as well as an aesthetic accomplishment. The regulated verse of the Tang, Lushi, was one of the most demanding literary forms ever institutionalized. 8 lines of 5 or 7 characters each, with tonal patterns that regulated the rising and falling tones of each character in specified relationships to the ones around it, with mandatory parallelism between certain pairs of lines, and with requirements of thematic development, from opening image through development through conclusion, that left almost no freedom at the level of formal constraint. Within these constraints, the greatest Tang poets produced poems of a compression and a resonance that translation can only partially convey, because the tonal music of the original Chinese and the visual character of the written characters are inseparable from the poem's effect in ways that translation by definition loses. No account of the Tang dynasty is complete without dwelling on the one figure who breaks every category the imperial system had established. Wu Zetian, who was the consort of Emperor Taizong, became the consort of his son, Emperor Gaozong, and eventually ruled China in her own name as emperor, the only woman in 2,000 years of imperial history to hold that title. Her story is one of the most extraordinary in Chinese history, and one of the most contested because the historical record that describes her was written overwhelmingly by the male Confucian scholars who were ideologically committed to the view that female rule was a disorder of the natural order, and that record's hostility to her has to be read as evidence of their values as much as of her character. Wu Zetian was born in 624 CE into a family of modest aristocratic background, and entered the palace at 14 as a concubine of the Emperor Taizong. After Taizong's death, she was supposed to become a Buddhist nun, as was the custom for imperial concubines who had not borne children. Instead, she became the favorite concubine, and then the empress of Taizong's son, Emperor Gaozong. The political implications of this transition, a woman passing from father to son, were deeply troubling to the Confucian officials of the court, who protested with varying degrees of energy and received varying degrees of punishment for their protests. Wu Zetian's ability to accumulate political power within the constraints of the imperial system, to outmaneuver the aristocratic families who dominated the Tang court, to build a base of support among the Buddhist religious establishment and among the examination-educated officials who resented the dominance of the old aristocracy, was remarkable. During the last years of Gaozong's reign, when he was ill, she effectively governed. After his death in 683, she served as regent for her sons, 2 of whom she removed from the throne, one for incompetence and one for resistance to her authority, and finally in 690 she declared herself emperor and renamed the dynasty the Zhou. She ruled for 15 years until 705, when a court coup restored the Tang dynasty and forced her into retirement. She died that year at approximately 80 years old. The account of her rule that the subsequent Tang historical tradition constructed was predictably hostile. She was portrayed as cruel, sexually voracious, manipulative, and fundamentally illegitimate, a usurper whose female nature made her rule a disorder that had to be corrected. Some of the specific accusations, that she killed her own infant daughter to frame a rival concubine, that she maintained male favourites whom she used sexually and discarded politically, may be accurate, may be inventions, or may be the kinds of actions that male rulers performed without special comment being reinterpreted as monstrous when performed by a woman. What is not contested is that she governed effectively. She expanded the examination system, reducing the dominance of the old aristocratic families in the bureaucracy. She conducted successful military campaigns in Korea and Central Asia. She patronized Buddhism generously and used the Buddhist establishment's legitimizing power for her own political purposes with a sophistication that the Confucian scholars who resented it found threatening precisely because it worked. The enormous Buddha statue carved into the cliff at Longmen near Luoyang, one of the great works of Tang Buddhist art, was commissioned partly with her patronage and is sometimes said to have been carved with her face. Her tomb, the Qianling Mausoleum outside Xi'an, is shared with Emperor Gaozong and has not been excavated. Near the entrance stands the wordless stele, a blank stone tablet that Wu Zetian ordered erected as her own monument, with no inscription. The traditional interpretation is that she left it blank to let posterity judge her, knowing that no words she wrote would survive the hostility of the male officials who would control her historical legacy. Whether this is the actual explanation is impossible to know, but the image of the blank stele has exercised the Chinese historical imagination for 13 centuries, and it remains one of the most resonant objects in the landscape of Imperial China. The 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period, the half-century of fragmentation between the Tang's fall in 907 and the Song dynasty's founding in 960, was chaotic enough to have a name that encapsulates its complexity, but it was brief enough that it functions in the larger narrative of Imperial China more as a clearing of the palette between 2 full courses than as a substantive historical period in its own right. What emerged from it, in the hands of the general Zhao Kuangyin, who became the first Song emperor by accepting his soldiers' proclamation of him as emperor in 960, was a dynasty that would produce what historians have called the most significant economic transformation in any society before the Industrial Revolution. The Song dynasty's commercial revolution was not an overnight event, but a series of mutually reinforcing developments across the 3 centuries of the Northern Song period, centered on the capital at Kaifeng, and then the 150 years of the Southern Song, after the northern half of China was conquered by the Jurchen Jin dynasty in 1127, and the Song court retreated south of the Yangtze River to re-establish itself at Linnan, the city that is now Hangzhou. The transformation involved agriculture, manufacturing, trade, finance, and technology in combinations that created an economy of a sophistication that Europe would not reach for another 3 or 4 centuries. The agricultural foundation of the commercial revolution was the introduction during the early 11th century of champa rice from Vietnam, a fast-ripening variety that matured in 60 days rather than the 150 days of existing rice varieties, which allowed double cropping in the warm and wet lands of the Yangtze Delta and multiple cropping further south. The consequence was an enormous increase in agricultural output per unit of land, which meant that the same quantity of land could feed a much larger population, which meant that people who would previously have been needed for farming could be released into manufacturing and trade. The population of China roughly doubled between the Tang and the Southern Song period, from perhaps 50 or 60 million to something in the range of 100 to 120 million. And this population growth was both a consequence and a cause of the economic expansion, because more people meant more producers and more consumers, and more of the specialized exchange that makes sophisticated economies possible. The industrial development of the Song period is one of the great under-acknowledged facts of world economic history. Song iron production, driven by the charcoal-fired furnaces of the Hebei province, and later by coke-fired furnaces that had no European equivalent until the 18th century, reached quantities that scholars have estimated at comparable to the iron production of Britain in the early Industrial Revolution. This was pig iron and cast iron, primarily used for agricultural tools, for coins, for weapons, for construction, for the enormous quantities of hardware that a commercial economy requires. Song porcelain production reached quantities and qualities that made it the defining luxury good of the Eurasian world. Song kilns at Jingdezhen and elsewhere produced wares whose technical sophistication, the precise control of kiln temperatures, the specific compositions of glazes, the throwing techniques for large thin-walled vessels, has never been fully replicated even with modern equipment. Song silk production fed not only the enormous domestic market, but the export trade that carried Chinese textiles to every market from Japan to the Persian Gulf. The financial infrastructure of the Song commercial economy included innovations that the rest of the world would not develop for centuries. Paper money, jiuzi and huizi, issued first by private merchant associations and then by the government, was in widespread circulation by the Northern Song period, solving the practical problem of how to conduct large commercial transactions when the alternative was carrying enormous quantities of heavy bronze coin. Letters of credit, merchant guilds with standardized commercial practices, and state-operated warehouses where goods could be stored as collateral for loans. These were the instruments of a credit economy that functioned, in its essential characteristics, more like a modern market economy than like anything contemporary Europe or the Islamic world had developed. The four great inventions that Chinese civilization is most famous for, paper, printing, gunpowder, and the compass, all either originated in China long before the Song or reached their mature, world-changing forms during the Song. Paper had been invented in China during the Han Dynasty. Block printing, printing from carved wooden blocks, had been practiced since the Tang. But it was the Song inventor Bi Sheng who, around 1040 CE, invented movable type, individual ceramic characters that could be arranged into text, printed, and then rearranged for the next document. The implication was exactly what it would be in Europe when Gutenberg reinvented the technique 400 years later. Cheap, rapid reproduction of text with the potential to transform literacy rates, disseminate knowledge, and support the development of a reading public. The Song printing industry was enormous. Texts of all kinds, from classical Confucian scholarship to popular fiction to technical manuals, were printed and sold in quantities that the manuscript culture of the previous millennium could not approach. Gunpowder had been discovered by Tang period alchemists looking for an elixir of immortality and finding instead a substance that produced fire and explosion when ignited. An early Chinese text describes the discovery in terms that suggest the experimenters were somewhat alarmed by the results. The Song military deployed gunpowder weapons in an increasingly sophisticated range of forms: fire arrows, bombs thrown by catapults, incendiary grenades, fire lances, early proto-firearms that used tubes of bamboo or metal filled with gunpowder and projectiles to produce an early version of the gun. The military imperative was urgent, because the Song faced the most difficult military situation of any major dynasty in Chinese history. It was surrounded on three sides by powerful, well-organized non-Chinese states that had mastered Chinese administrative and military techniques, and were militarily competitive with the Song despite being far smaller in population and resources. The Liu dynasty of the Khitan people in the northeast, the Xixia of the Tangut people in the northwest, the Jin dynasty of the Jurchen people, who conquered northern China in 1127, were not the disorganized steppe nomads that Han armies had defeated by sheer weight of numbers. They were sophisticated military states, and the Song responses to them included the most intensive development of firepower weapons in the pre-modern world. The compass, developed for magnetic navigation on Song merchant ships in the late 11th and early 12th centuries, enabled the dramatic expansion of maritime trade that characterized the southern Song economy. Song merchant ships, guided by the compass, and built with the watertight bulkheads and the balanced rudder that Chinese shipbuilders had developed, sailed to every port in Southeast Asia, to India, to Ceylon, to the Persian Gulf, to the East African coast. The Arab geographers who described the Chinese merchant ships they encountered in the Indian Ocean were astonished by their size, their seaworthiness, and the number of people they carried. The maritime trade of the southern Song, when the loss of northern China had cut the dynasty off from the overland Silk Road, was one of the primary economic engines of the dynasty's surprising prosperity, even in its diminished territorial state. The intellectual life of the Song period was as rich as the economic. Neo-Confucianism, the philosophical synthesis that reinterpreted the Confucian classics through the lens of Buddhist metaphysical questions that those classics had never addressed, reached its mature form in the work of the philosopher Zhu Xi, who wrote in the 12th century and whose interpretation of the Confucian tradition was adopted as the orthodox interpretation for the state examinations from the 14th century onward. Zhu Xi's Neo-Confucianism was not a simple return to the original Confucius. It incorporated the concept of lie, principle or pattern as the metaphysical foundation of the moral and social order, and the concept of qi, material force, as the medium through which principle was realized in the physical world, creating a philosophical system of considerable sophistication that attempted to answer the kinds of cosmological and metaphysical questions that Buddhism had raised without abandoning the Confucian emphasis on social relationships and political governance. The synthesis was brilliant and also, in some of its applications, particularly the interpretation of the 5 relationships of Confucian ethics in terms that emphasized the subordination of women, the subservience of juniors to seniors, and the absolute authority of the emperor, consequential in ways that were not always humane. The Mongol conquest of China, which began with Genghis Khan's initial incursions into northern China starting in 1211, and was not completed until Kublai Khan's final destruction of the southern Song in 1279, was the greatest external catastrophe in Chinese imperial history, and it was also, paradoxically, one of the most significant episodes of global connection that China would experience until the 19th century. The demographic destruction was enormous. The population of northern China, according to census data before and after the conquest, fell by roughly 30 to 40%, from deaths in battle, from the systematic destruction of cities and agricultural infrastructure by Mongol armies, and from the famines and epidemics that followed. The landscape of the North China Plain was in some areas reduced to depopulated scrubland, and the recovery took generations. Kublai Khan, who became Great Khan of the Mongol Empire in 1260, and who completed the conquest of southern China by 1279, was a different kind of Mongol ruler from the empire-building destroyers of his grandfather's generation. He'd grown up partly in China, had Chinese tutors, spoke Chinese, and had absorbed enough of Chinese political culture to understand that governing China required Chinese administrative methods rather than the steppe pastoral organization that worked for governing Mongols in Mongolia. He established his capital at Dadu, the great capital, which is now Beijing, adopting the traditional Chinese imperial capital pattern and the Chinese ceremonial system alongside his Mongol court practices. He proclaimed his dynasty the Yuan, meaning great origin, and styled himself as the legitimate successor to the Song emperors, inserting himself into the dynastic sequence of Chinese history rather than presenting himself as an external conqueror who had simply overwhelmed the native civilization. The Yuan dynasty that Kublai created was cosmopolitan in ways that even the Tang had not been. The Mongol Imperium, at its height stretching from Korea to Poland, from Siberia to Persia, created something that historians call the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative peace and security across the entire Eurasian landmass under Mongol protection, that allowed the movement of people, goods and ideas at scales and speeds that had not previously been possible. The Silk Road, which had been fragmented and dangerous for centuries, was once again safe for travel from China to the Mediterranean. It was in this context that Marco Polo made his famous journey east, spending 17 years in Kublai Khan's court, and producing an account of what he saw that was treated as wildly implausible by European readers who could not imagine the scale and sophistication of the civilization he was describing. The debates about what Marco Polo actually saw and whether his account is reliable have occupied scholars for centuries. What is not disputed is that his travels gave European readers their first detailed, if filtered, view of East Asian civilization, and that the book directly inspired Columbus and other later explorers who were trying to find a sea route to the wealth that Marco Polo had described. The Yuan dynasty's most consequential long-term legacy for Chinese history was not anything it built, but something it disrupted. The civil service examination system, which Kublai suspended for most of his reign, because it would have produced a Chinese-educated bureaucracy that he correctly identified as a potential source of resistance to Mongol rule. The Mongols preferred to staff their administration with Central Asian Muslims, Persians and Europeans, people who owed their positions entirely to Mongol patronage, rather than to the Chinese educational tradition, alongside the Han Chinese whom they allowed to serve in lower-ranking positions. The suspension of the examinations removed for a generation the primary institutional mechanism through which the Confucian scholarly class reproduced itself and staffed the government. And when the Yuan collapsed in 1368 and the Ming dynasty restored the examinations, the restoration was made with the emotional intensity of a civilization recovering something it had almost lost. The Black Death, which devastated Europe in the 1340s and 1350s, originated in Central Asia and reached Europe through the Mongol trade networks that had otherwise been one of the great benefits of the Pax Mongolica. China itself suffered severely from epidemic disease in the mid-14th century, and the combination of epidemic mortality, natural disasters, and the escalating incompetence and corruption of the late Yuan administration produced the popular uprisings, the Red Turban Rebellion and associated movements, that eventually destroyed the dynasty. The man who emerged from the chaos of those rebellions to found the Ming dynasty was one of the most unlikely emperors in Chinese history. Zhu Yuanzhang, born in 1328 to a desperately poor peasant family in Anhui province, orphaned by famine and epidemic when he was 16, turned to begging, joined a Buddhist monastery as a lay attendant for food, eventually joined the Red Turban movement as a soldier, and rose through it to leadership on the strength of his military and administrative abilities. He became the Hongwu Emperor, founder of the Ming dynasty in 1368, the first man of genuinely peasant origin to win the dragon throne since Liu Bang, the founder of the Han. The Ming dynasty, which lasted from 1368 to 1644, was in many ways the dynasty of restoration, the deliberate recovery of Chinese civilization from the humiliation of Mongol rule, the rebuilding of the institutions, the infrastructure, and the cultural confidence that the Yuan had disrupted. The Hongwu Emperor restored the examination system, rebuilt the imperial administration, reorganized the agricultural tax system, invested in flood control and irrigation infrastructure, and attempted, through a combination of draconian laws against corruption and an elaborate surveillance system that reached into every village, to impose an order on Chinese society that his own traumatic experience of disorder had made him absolutely determined to achieve. His methods were brutal. He executed tens of thousands of officials and their families during his reign, sometimes for offences so minor that later commentators found the proportionality difficult to defend. But the order he imposed was real, and the agricultural and demographic recovery of China during the early Ming was genuinely impressive. The Yongle Emperor, the third Ming Emperor, who seized the throne from his nephew in a civil war and ruled from 1402 to 1424, is responsible for two of the most spectacular achievements of the dynasty. The first was the decision to move the imperial capital from Nanjing, where the Hongwu Emperor had established it as a statement of southern Chinese legitimacy, to Beijing, which had been the Yuan capital, and which occupied a strategic position on the boundary between the agricultural North China Plain and the steppe frontier. The forbidden city that Yongle built in Beijing, the imperial palace, the Great Within, the palace complex whose name in Chinese means the Purple Forbidden City, referring to the pole star around which the heavens revolve, is one of the greatest architectural achievements of any civilization and one of the most complete survivals of pre-modern palace architecture in the world. Completed in 1420, it covers 180 acres, contains approximately 980 buildings and 8,128 rooms, is surrounded by a moat and a wall, and was the residence of every Chinese emperor from Yongle to Puyi, a span of 500 years and 24 emperors. The geometrical precision of its planning, the specific symbolism of every architectural element, the careful integration of cosmic symbolism into the layout, the emperor's throne at the center of the world at the junction of the four directions under heaven, makes it as much a political and cosmological statement as an architectural one. The second achievement of the Yongle reign was Zheng He's treasure voyages, the 7 great naval expeditions of 1405 to 1433 that are among the most extraordinary feats of pre-modern maritime exploration. Zheng He himself was extraordinary. Born Ma He in 1371 in Yunnan, captured as a child when the Ming armies conquered the region from the remaining Yuan forces, castrated and made a palace eunuch, he had risen to become the most trusted military commander and administrator of the Yongle Emperor. He was a Muslim, which proved practically useful in navigating the trading communities of the Indian Ocean world. The fleet he commanded was of a scale that had no contemporary equivalent. On the first voyage alone, approximately 317 ships and 27,000 men. The largest vessels, the so-called treasure ships, were described in period sources as being on the order of 120 to 130 meters long, though scholars debate these dimensions. What is not disputed is that they were far larger than any European ship of the same period, and that the fleet they were part of represented a projection of Chinese imperial power across the Indian Ocean world that was, in its scale and sophistication without parallel. The voyages went to Vietnam, Java, Malacca, Ceylon, Calicut, and beyond, into the Persian Gulf, along the Arabian coast, and down the East African coast as far as what is now Kenya and Tanzania. Decades before Vasco da Gama first rounded the Cape of Good Hope, they were not primarily commercial ventures in the European sense. They were diplomatic expeditions designed to draw the states and peoples of the Indian Ocean world into the Chinese tributary system, to present gifts and receive acknowledgement of Chinese imperial supremacy, and to bring back the exotic products, giraffes from Africa, lions from Persia, ostriches from Arabia, that demonstrated the reach of the emperor's beneficence. Giraffes were identified by the Chinese court as the legendary Qilin, a propitious mythical creature whose appearance signified the reign of a sage emperor, which gave the voyages an ideological significance that reinforced their diplomatic function. And then, with stunning abruptness, the voyages stopped. The Mongol emperor died in 1424. His son and successor was hostile to the whole enterprise, viewing the enormous cost of the expeditions and the influence of the eunuch admirals who commanded them as threats to the Confucian bureaucratic order. The last voyage, in 1431 to 1433, was the seventh. After Zheng He's death during that voyage, no further expeditions were organised. The shipyards fell into disuse. The records of the voyages were deliberately suppressed. A court official destroyed them, apparently to prevent any future emperor from being tempted by the example. The Haijin, sea prohibition, tightened progressively across the following century, eventually banning the construction of ocean-going vessels entirely. China turned inward, and the great question of what would have happened had China continued to project maritime power into the Atlantic world, where the Chinese ships might have reached the Americas, where the Chinese colonial presence in the Indian Ocean would have prevented the European domination that followed Vasco da Gama's first voyage in 1498, became one of the great counterfactuals of world history. The late Ming period, from roughly the mid-16th century onward, was characterized by a paradox that would eventually prove fatal. The formal institutions of the imperial state continued to function. The civil service examinations continued to select scholars for official positions. The Confucian ritual system continued to organize the court's ceremonial life, but the actual governance of the empire was increasingly dysfunctional. A succession of emperors were either uninterested in the duties of their position. One notorious emperor, the Fanli Emperor, essentially stopped attending court for the last 15 years of his reign, or so young that real power rested with eunuch advisors whose factional politics consumed the court's energy. The bureaucracy, trained by an examination system that valued classical learning over practical administrative skill, was often poorly equipped to deal with the specific practical challenges of the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The fiscal strain of wars with Japan over Korea in the 1590s, the growing military power of the Jurchen people under their leader Nurhaci in Manchuria, the series of famines and natural disasters that reduced the agricultural productivity of the north in the 1630s and 1640s. The fall of the Ming was precipitated by a peasant rebellion. Li Zicheng, a former postal worker who had lost his government job in one of the fiscal cutbacks of the late Ming period, raised an army from the desperate and dispossessed peasants of the northwest and swept toward Beijing in 1644. The last Ming emperor, the Chongzhen Emperor, hanged himself from a tree in the imperial garden on Coal Hill behind the Forbidden City as Li Zicheng's forces entered the capital. A Ming general, Wu Sangui, who commanded the garrison at Shanhai Pass, the strategic gap in the Great Wall where the wall met the sea, made the decision that determined China's future for the next 3 centuries. Rather than submit to Li Zicheng, he opened the pass to the Manchu armies that had been pressing against it from the north, inviting them in as allies against the rebel. The Manchus, the people that Norheichi had organized into a disciplined military and administrative state, who called their dynasty the Qing, meaning pure, accepted. They entered Beijing, drove out Li Zicheng, and then kept going. The Qing dynasty, 1644 to 1912, the longest reigning of China's major dynasties, was the last, and it was ruled by Manchus, a non-Chinese people from Manchuria, whose relationship to China was both the source of their greatest strength and the source of their greatest vulnerability. Their greatest strength: they had conquered the most populous and most administratively sophisticated country in the world, and they had done it by adopting with remarkable speed and thoroughness the Chinese institutional framework that made governing it possible. The Qing kept the civil service examination system. They kept the Confucian ideology. They kept the Ming administrative machinery, including the Forbidden City, which became their imperial palace just as it had been the Ming's. They recruited Han Chinese officials into the upper levels of the bureaucracy alongside Manchu officials, developing a system of parallel Manchu and Han appointments at senior levels that was expensive but effective at maintaining Manchu political dominance while using Han expertise for actual governance. Their greatest vulnerability: they were Manchus, not Chinese, and the Han majority of their subjects never entirely forgot it. The imposition of the queue, the requirement that Han Chinese men adopt the Manchu male hairstyle, shaving the front of the head and wearing the remaining hair in a long braid behind, was the most visible mark of Manchu cultural dominance and was enforced with violence. The slogan of the early Qing enforcement campaign was "Wear the queue or lose your head." The queue became, over the following 2.5 centuries, such a familiar feature of Chinese appearance that was associated in the Western imagination simply with China. The Europeans who encountered Qing China in the 18th and 19th centuries assumed the queue was an ancient Chinese tradition, when it was in fact a Manchu imposition of less than 2 centuries standing. The High Qing period, roughly from the Kangxi Emperor's consolidation of power in the 1680s through the Qianlong Emperor's abdication in 1795, was a period of genuine prosperity and territorial expansion. The 3 long-reigning emperors of this period, Kangxi, who reigned from 1661 to 1722, Yongzheng from 1722 to 1735, and Qianlong from 1735 to 1796, were by any measure capable rulers who governed a China that was, by the standards of the late 17th and 18th centuries, the richest, most populous, and most powerful state in the world. The territorial expansion of the High Qing, the conquest of Xinjiang in the northwest, the incorporation of Tibet, the extension of Chinese sovereignty into Mongolia and Manchuria, created the largest Chinese state in history and roughly the largest empire on earth. The population of China under the Qing expanded dramatically, from something in the range of 150 million at the dynasty's establishment to perhaps 400 million by the early 19th century, partly because the Qing invested heavily in agricultural development, partly because the introduction of American food crops that had been arriving in China since the 16th century, sweet potatoes, maize, peanuts, which could be grown on marginal land that rice could not use, expanded the agricultural frontier. The Kangxi Emperor's intellectual interests included Western science and technology. He had Jesuit astronomers at his court, learned enough mathematics to discuss astronomical problems with them, and commissioned the Jesuits to produce accurate maps of the empire. The Qianlong Emperor was one of the great patrons of Chinese high culture. He commissioned encyclopedias and literary anthologies of colossal scope, collected painting and calligraphy on an enormous scale, and wrote, by his own account, tens of thousands of poems, though the literary quality of the imperial poems was diplomatically not subjected to critical scrutiny by the officials who had to comment on them. But the Qianlong Emperor also ordered the compilation of the Siku Quanshu, the complete library of the four treasuries, which is simultaneously one of the greatest literary preservation projects in history, collecting tens of thousands of texts from across Chinese civilization, and one of the most systematic literary censorship campaigns in history, in which texts that could be interpreted as critical of Manchu rule or of the Qing dynasty were quietly destroyed or altered before inclusion. The tension between the Qing's genuine patronage of Chinese high culture and its systematic political control of that culture's critical capacities is one of the defining contradictions of the High Qing period. Lord Macartney's mission to the Qianlong Emperor in 1793 is one of the most famous diplomatic encounters in the history of Sino-Western relations, and it is famous partly for what it reveals about the Qianlong Emperor's extraordinary and, as it turned out, deeply consequential confidence in China's self-sufficiency. Macartney led a British diplomatic mission charged with opening formal diplomatic relations with China and negotiating expanded trading access for British merchants, who had been restricted to the single port of Canton and found the restrictions commercially frustrating. The Qianlong Emperor's letter to King George III in response to the mission's requests is one of the most instructive documents in the history of cultural misunderstanding. He politely but absolutely declined every request, explaining that China possessed all things in prolific abundance and had no need of the manufactures of outside barbarians. The specific things that the British were trying to sell in China, mechanical clocks, scientific instruments, manufactured textiles, were, from the Qianlong Emperor's perspective, curiosities rather than necessities. They were not wrong that China had everything it needed. They were wrong about how long that condition would persist. The 19th century destroyed the world that the Qianlong Emperor's letter described, and it did so with a speed and a completeness that Imperial China's institutional framework was structurally unprepared to respond to. The First Opium War of 1839 to 1842 was the moment when the divergence between China's self-understanding and the military reality of its position in the world became undeniable. The proximate cause was the British opium trade. The East India Company had been shipping Indian-grown opium to China in exchange for Chinese silk, tea and porcelain, reversing the trade deficit that had previously required British merchants to pay in silver for Chinese goods. The Qing court, alarmed by the spread of opium addiction and the consequent drain of silver from the Chinese economy, appointed the commissioner Lin Zexu to suppress the trade. Lin Zexu was an unusually capable official who wrote with eloquence about the immorality of the trade and who took effective action to suppress it, confiscating and destroying approximately 200 tons of opium at Canton in 1839. The British government, at the urging of the merchants whose property had been destroyed, sent a naval expedition. The Chinese military was destroyed. The treaty that ended the war, the Treaty of Nanking of 1842, required China to cede Hong Kong to Britain, open 5 ports to British trade, pay an enormous indemnity, and grant British subjects the right to be tried by British rather than Chinese courts when in China. The era of the unequal treaties had begun. The Taiping Rebellion, which erupted in 1850 and was not suppressed until 1864, was the most destructive civil war in human history, measured by casualties. The movement's leader, Hong Xiuquan, was a Hakka Chinese from Guangdong who had failed the civil service examinations 4 times, a failure that carried enormous social shame in a culture where examination success was the primary mark of a man's worth, and who, after his fourth failure, experienced a visionary episode that he subsequently interpreted as a revelation of his identity as the younger brother of Jesus Christ. He founded a movement, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, that combined Christian theological elements with specific social reforms, including the abolition of foot binding, the prohibition of opium, and the redistribution of land, and that attracted the desperate and dispossessed of the South Chinese countryside, in numbers that eventually produced a movement controlling a large portion of southern China, with its capital at Nanjing. The Qing armies were unable to suppress it. It was eventually destroyed through the combination of the Western-officered ever-victorious army, the regional forces organized by Zheng Guofan and Li Hongjiang, two of the ablest Chinese officials of the 19th century, and the gradual exhaustion of the Taiping itself. The death toll across the 14 years of the rebellion is estimated at between 20 and 30 million people. It is the deadliest civil conflict in world history. The Taiping Rebellion had a political consequence that outlasted the rebellion itself. The necessity of suppressing it forced the Qing central government to devolve military and fiscal power to the regional strongmen, Zheng Guofan, Li Hongjiang, and their successors, who could actually organize effective resistance. This decentralization of power, which proved irreversible, was the beginning of the structural fragmentation of imperial authority that would accelerate through the final decades of the dynasty and culminate in the warlordism of the early republic. The self-strengthening movement of the 1860s through the 1890s was the Qing court's attempt to modernize enough to resist Western military pressure without fundamentally changing the Confucian political and social framework within which the empire operated. Its motto, Chinese learning for the fundamental principles, Western learning for practical application, described a position that was practically coherent but strategically inadequate. You could not adopt Western military technology effectively without also adopting the industrial and educational infrastructure that produced it, and you could not do that without the kind of social and political reorganization that the Confucian framework made impossible to accommodate. The defeat of China by Japan in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, the humiliation of being beaten by a country that had successfully modernized, a neighbor that China had historically regarded as a cultural tributary, demonstrated the limits of the self-strengthening approach with a finality that shocked the Chinese intellectual class into rethinking everything. Empress Dowager Cixi, the former concubine who had become regent for her son and then for her nephew, and who effectively controlled the Qing court from 1861 until her death in 1908, is one of the most powerful and most controversial figures in the history of Imperial China. She's been portrayed as a conservative obstacle to necessary reform, and that portrayal has genuine merit. Her coup against the Guangxu Emperor in 1898, which ended the 100 days of reform that he had attempted with the encouragement of the reformer Kang Yuwei, is the clearest example. She has also been portrayed as a capable political operator who kept a failing dynasty alive for nearly half a century in circumstances that would have defeated less resourceful politicians, and that portrayal also has genuine merit. The truth is that she was both genuinely capable within the political and ideological framework she inhabited, and ultimately unable to transcend the limitations of that framework at the moment when transcending it was the only thing that would have saved what she was trying to preserve. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900 was the moment when Cixi's political calculation failed catastrophically. The Boxers, the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, a movement that combined martial arts practice with a folk religious belief in supernatural invulnerability, and that directed its violence primarily against Chinese Christians and foreign missionaries, besieged the foreign legation quarter in Beijing for 55 days. Cixi's decision to support the Boxers and declare war on the foreign powers represented the option that seemed, in the desperate political logic of the moment, like the only available way of defending Chinese sovereignty. It was in practice an enormous strategic miscalculation. The eight-nation alliance that assembled to relieve the legations marched on Beijing, looted it extensively, and imposed the Boxer Protocol of 1901, which required China to pay an indemnity of 450 million taels of silver, more than the total annual revenue of the Qing government, to be paid over 39 years. The final decade of the dynasty was a decade of reform. The new policies of the post-Boxer period included genuine institutional changes, including the abolition of the civil service examination system in 1905 after 1,300 years of continuous operation, and the adoption of a constitutional framework. But the reforms came too late and moved too slowly. The intellectual and revolutionary movements that had been building since the 1890s, Sun Yat-sen's revolutionary organization, the increasingly radical constitutional movement, the new army officers educated in Japan and Germany who had absorbed ideas about nationalism and popular sovereignty, had already concluded that the Qing dynasty was not reformable, that its Manchu identity was an obstacle to Chinese nationalism, and that the 2,000 years of imperial governance needed to end. The Wuchang Uprising of October 10, 1911, a mutiny by new army troops in Hubei province that began accidentally when a bomb exploded prematurely at a revolutionary cell's headquarters, and the members fled, leaving behind a membership list that panicked the army officers into revolting before they were arrested, triggered a cascade of provincial secessions that left the Qing court without effective military support. The court recalled Yuan Shikai, the most capable military commander of the late Qing, who had been dismissed and sent home after Cixi's death. Yuan negotiated simultaneously with the Republican revolutionaries in the south and with the court in Beijing, eventually extracting from the court the abdication he needed to offer the revolutionaries, and from the revolutionaries the promise of the presidency of the new republic that he needed to offer the court. On February 12, 1912, the Empress Dowager Longyu signed the abdication edict on behalf of the 6-year-old Puyi. 2,132 years of imperial governance ended with the signature of a woman acting for a child in a hall in the Forbidden City. What did those 2,000 years produce, and what do they leave behind? The question can be answered at multiple levels, and each level reveals something different about what the imperial system was and what it meant. At the material level, it produced the built environment of Chinese civilization that still structures the physical experience of the country. The Great Wall that the tourists visit in Mutianyu and Badaling, which is a Ming construction, but whose logic runs back to the Qin. The Forbidden City, whose layout and whose specific buildings date from the Yongle Emperor and his successors. The Grand Canal, whose basic engineering dates from the Sui and Tang, which was still carrying freight when the railways replaced it in the 20th century. Hundreds of cities across China, whose street patterns and whose central temples and examination halls and city walls reflect the administrative geography of dynasties that ended centuries ago. The terraced rice paddies of the southeast, whose agricultural logic was developed over the first millennium CE, and which still feed people with the same basic technology, enormously refined by modern inputs, that the Song farmers used. At the cultural level, the legacy is even more pervasive. The written Chinese language, the characters that are read in different pronunciations by speakers of Mandarin, Cantonese, Hokkien, Shanghainese, and a dozen other languages and dialects, is the system that the Qin standardization set the foundation for, transmitted through 2,000 years of imperial examination and official correspondence. The poetry of the Tang, memorized by every educated Chinese person through 2 millennia of literary education, is still memorized by Chinese schoolchildren and is still part of the texture of Chinese literary and conversational culture. The philosophical tradition of Confucianism, however it has been modified, challenged, attacked, and partially rehabilitated in the modern period, continues to shape the values of Chinese social life in ways that are visible in the emphasis on education, on family solidarity, on the hierarchical respect that younger people are expected to show to older ones, on the long-term relationship between governance and moral responsibility that Chinese political culture has consistently expected. The question of what Imperial China looked like from the inside, what it was like to actually live in it, not as an emperor or a great general, but as the examination candidate who spent years preparing, as the farmer whose harvest determined whether the dynasty's tax registers were fulfilled, as the woman whose life was shaped by expectations that most of the official record did not bother to articulate, is the question that the standard narrative of dynasties and battles tends to leave unanswered. The civil service examination candidate's experience was one of the defining human experiences of Imperial Chinese civilization, one that shaped the consciousness of educated Chinese men for over 1,000 years. The examination system had 3 main levels by the Ming and Qing periods. The entry-level examinations were held at the prefectural level and produced the degree of Sheng Yuan, literally government students, often called shukai in common parlance, a status that exempted the holder from certain physical punishments, allowed access to local officials, and was a mark of social respectability, but that gave no access to government appointment. The provincial examinations, held every 3 years in the provincial capital, produced the Juran degree, recommended men, and opened the door to official appointment. The metropolitan examinations, held in Beijing every 3 years in the years following the provincial examinations, produced the Jinshi degree, presented scholars, with the highest ranked Jinshi in each cohort being tested again by the emperor himself in the palace examination that determined final placement. The entire process from beginning to end could take decades. Many men spent their entire adult lives taking the provincial examination repeatedly without passing. The famous short story writer Pu Songling, author of The Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio, failed the provincial examination 11 times between 1651 and 1706, finally abandoning the attempt when he was in his 70s. The examination itself was conducted under conditions of extraordinary rigour. Candidates were searched for hidden texts, sat in individual cells for the duration of the several-day examination, and were identified only by number so that the markers would not know whose paper they were reading. The primary text required was the 8-legged essay, the Bagwan, a rigidly prescribed form in which the candidate was required to develop a theme from the Confucian classics through a sequence of 8 formal sections, each with a specified character length and a specified rhetorical function. The form was as demanding as the Tang regulated verse and as artificial. The purpose was not to produce useful ideas about governance, but to demonstrate mastery of the classical tradition and facility with the prescribed form, on the theory that a man who could demonstrate mastery of the classics would be capable of the moral and intellectual qualities that good governance required. The critique of this theory, that it selected for classical learning and formal elegance rather than for the practical skills of flood control and tax collection and military organization that actual governance required, was made by Chinese reformers throughout the Ming and Qing periods and was entirely valid. The system persisted partly because it did what it was actually designed to do. It created a class of men with a shared educational formation, a common cultural reference point, and a demonstrated ability to work within prescribed constraints, which was exactly what the imperial bureaucracy needed its members to have. The farmers who provided the economic foundation for all of this, who grew the rice and the wheat and the millet that fed the scholar and the soldier and the emperor, lived lives whose texture is recoverable from a combination of local gazettes, agricultural manuals, legal records, and the poetry that upper-class Chinese writers produced about the countryside. They were mostly observing from a comfortable distance. The agricultural village of the imperial period was organized around the extended family, with its collective obligations of labor exchange and mutual insurance against harvest failure, its ancestral hall where the patrilineal descent group conducted its ceremonies, its communal lands whose harvest supplemented the income of individual households. The village was administered within the imperial system through the Ligia and later the Baogia systems, mutual responsibility networks in which households were grouped into units that were collectively responsible for tax collection, for reporting crimes, and for maintaining order, with the head of each unit responsible to the level above him, and ultimately to the county magistrate. The county magistrate, the Xixian, the man who knew the county, was the point at which the imperial state most directly intersected with the lives of ordinary people. He was typically a Jinshi graduate who had been appointed to a county in a province other than his native province, to prevent him from developing local loyalties that would compromise his function as an imperial representative. He had responsibility for tax collection, for the maintenance of order, for the adjudication of civil and criminal disputes, for the maintenance of roads, bridges, and irrigation infrastructure, and for the ceremonies that maintain the ritual connection between the local community and the cosmic order. He usually had a staff of a few dozen clerks, runners, and servants, and was expected to administer a county of typically 30 to 100,000 people with those limited resources. The gap between the scale of the responsibility and the scale of the resources was closed partly by the cooperation of the local gentry, the degree holders and wealthy families who did not hold official positions but who maintained social order through their informal authority, and partly by the simple fact that most of what ordinary people did in their daily lives did not require imperial attention. Women in Imperial China occupied a space within the Confucian social order that was formally subordinate and practically variable. Subordinate in the formal ideology, variable in practice because the realities of agricultural life, of commerce, of the household economy, and of the specific circumstances of individual families created enormous variation in the actual roles that women filled. The three obediences that Confucian ideology prescribed, obedience to father before marriage, to husband after marriage, and to son in widowhood, described an ideal of female subordination that was more consistently approximated in the upper classes, where women's lives were more thoroughly governed by the gentry family's concern for its reputation than in the farming communities where women worked in the fields alongside men and managed the household economy with an authority that the formal ideology did not acknowledge, but that daily life required. Foot binding. The practice of binding young girls' feet tightly to prevent normal growth, creating the small, arched foot called the lotus foot that was considered beautiful in the upper classes of Chinese society from approximately the Song period onward, was one of the most physically consequential expressions of the Confucian construction of femininity. Its origins are obscure and have been the subject of considerable historical debate. It appears to have begun in the Song period in the upper classes and spread downward through the social hierarchy over the following centuries, though it never penetrated the farming communities thoroughly. because women whose feet had been bound could not work in the fields. The bound foot was simultaneously a mark of social class. Only families wealthy enough to have women who did not need to do agricultural labour could afford it, and an instrument of control, since a woman with bound feet could not easily walk far from home. Its abolition became one of the causes of the 19th and early 20th century reformers, and the success of that cause, which saw foot binding largely disappear within a generation of the dynasty's fall, is one of the clearest examples of the social transformation that the end of the imperial system enabled. At the global level, the imperial system's contributions were not limited to the Chinese world. The technologies that moved westward along the Silk Road, paper, printing, gunpowder, the compass, were the enabling technologies of the European Renaissance, of the European Reformation, of the European Age of Exploration. Paper made European literary culture possible. Printing made the Reformation possible. Luther's theses spread because they could be printed, and the printing press itself was Bisheng's movable type, transmitted through the Islamic world and reinvented by Gutenberg. Gunpowder made the European nation-states possible by undermining the castle-based military power of the feudal aristocracy. The compass made the European Age of Exploration possible. 4 Chinese inventions remade the world, and none of them are credited in the popular Western consciousness to the civilization that produced them. The civil service examination system, the 1200-year experiment in meritocratic governance that ended in 1905, influenced the development of civil service examinations in Europe. The British East India Company's examinations for its Indian civil service, the Northcote Trevelyan reforms of the British civil service in the 1850s, the American civil service reforms of the 1880s, all of these were explicitly influenced by the Chinese model that European observers had been describing and admiring since the 16th century. The principle that government office should be won by demonstrated competence rather than by birth or patronage, however imperfectly realized in practice in either China or Europe, is one of the most consequential ideas in the history of governance, and it has a specifically Chinese origin. The dynastic cycle, the pattern by which Chinese dynasties rose through military conquest, consolidated through administrative development, flourished in their golden ages, weakened through corruption and fiscal crisis and military overextension, and eventually collapsed into the civil wars from which the next dynasty emerged, is one of the most persistent patterns in human political history, and Chinese civilization both experienced it repeatedly and theorized it explicitly. The mandate of heaven concept built the dynastic cycle into the ideological framework of the imperial system, acknowledging that dynasties fall and legitimizing the replacements that rise to take their place. This cycle was not merely an observation, but a structural feature of a system that had no mechanism for peaceful political transition, and that therefore required periodic, violent renewal. The question of why the cycle eventually ended, why the Qing's fall in 1912 produced a republic rather than a new dynasty, is one of the most interesting questions in modern Chinese history, and the answer involves the specific combination of Western imperialism, nationalism as a new legitimizing ideology, and the military and institutional weakness of the late Qing in ways that distinguish the end of the Qing from all previous dynastic collapses. The last emperor, Puyi, born in 1906 on the throne at 3, abdicating at 6, expelled from the Forbidden City in 1924, installed as the Japanese puppet emperor of Manchukuo in 1934, captured by the Soviet Red Army in 1945, returned to China and re-educated by the communist government, dying in 1967 as a gardener at the Beijing Botanical Garden. had a biography that reads like the allegory of the entire imperial system's passage through the 20th century. The immense dignity and the total irrelevance, the elaborate ceremonial that continued inside the Forbidden City long after it had ceased to connect to any political reality outside, and then the gradual, sometimes painful, sometimes absurd process of becoming an ordinary citizen of the revolutionary state that had replaced the world he'd been born to rule. His autobiography, My Story, and Bernardo Bertolucci's film based on it, The Last Emperor, give him a humanity and a complexity that the abstract ending of an empire does not. Remind you that the 2,000 years of the imperial system, for all that it was a system, was also a sequence of individual human lives, each one trying to make sense of the world they had inherited and the world they were living in. The night is settling around you now, and the 2,000-year story has reached its end, or the end that 1912 provides, which is the end of one chapter rather than the end of the civilization. The civilization continues. Beijing is still the capital. The Forbidden City is still there as a museum now, its galleries containing the paintings and the bronzes and the imperial porcelain of dynasties going back to the Shang. The characters that Qin Shi Huang standardized are still being written and read by more than 1 billion people. The poetry of the Tang is still being memorized in Chinese schools. The philosophical questions that Confucius raised about the proper relationship between a ruler and the people, between knowledge and action, between the ideal and the actual, these are still being argued about, in different languages and different registers, in China and everywhere else that the imperial legacy has travelled. 2,000 years of dynasties, of walls and canals and examination halls and treasure ships and terracotta armies and paper money and movable type and gunpowder and the compass and the poem about the old emperor who lost the woman he loved on the road to Sichuan. 2,000 years of the mandate of heaven passing from hand to hand, of the dynastic cycle turning and turning, of the scholar official who had passed his examinations sitting in his office, composing the memorial to the emperor that might or might not be read, in a system so large that no one could hold all of it in mind at once, governed by a philosophy so old that even the people who questioned it thought in its categories. The first emperor's terracotta army is still standing in the dark pits of Xi'an, patient as they have been for 2,200 years, waiting for the emperor who will not come back, guarding a tomb that will not be opened. The last emperor's garden in Beijing is gone now, replaced by the botanical garden where he worked in his final years. But the Forbidden City that he left at 18 when the warlords expelled him is still there, its golden roofs shining in whatever light is falling on them tonight. The great river is still running. The rice paddies are still there. The characters are still being written. The examination that the last candidate took in 1905 is over. The dynasty that the last emperor left in 1912 is over. The civilization is not over. It is something else now, something that the first emperor could not have imagined, and that Puyi lived long enough to see the beginning of. But the thread runs back, through all the dynasties, through all the walls and the canals and the palaces and the poems, to the 3-century conversation that produced Confucius and Laozi, and the legalists, and the first serious attempt to think clearly about how a very large number of human beings could live together in a way that was organized and just and beautiful and worth the cost of sustaining. Let all of that settle around you now. The Yellow River is still out there, dark tonight, running its old course between the old Loess banks, carrying the soil of the Loess Plateau to the sea as it has for 10,000 years, indifferent to dynasties, indifferent to mandate. The Great Wall is dark and quiet on its ridgeline. The Forbidden City is lit at the edges. Somewhere in a pit in Xi'an, 8,000 clay soldiers stand at attention in the dark, waiting. Rest easy.